Oh my goodness, get ready to crack them brain folds wide open because in this video I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the Enlightenment for AP European history, and there is a lot. So as folks like Galileo and Kepler were using new methods of thinking and observation to revolutionize humanity's conception of the natural world, Enlightenment thinkers started thinking, I wonder if we can apply those same methods of thinking to social and human institutions. And spoiler alert, that's what they did. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked with a healthy dose of rationalism, let's get to it. So let's start with the definition of the Enlightenment. And hey, if you don't want to write it all down, then I've got note guides for this video and all my videos you can grab right here. So the Enlightenment was a European intellectual movement in the 18th century that applied new methods of rational thinking to social and human institutions. And in general, there were three main emphases of this movement that you need to know. First, the methods of science pioneered by Kepler and Newton and Galileo and others could be used to improve society. The name for this was rationalism, and it meant that everything in human life could and should be submitted to the process of reason. Second, Enlightenment thinkers believed that as the scientific method could be used to discover the laws of nature, it could also be used to discover the laws of society. And third, if both of the first two were true, then Enlightenment thought could lead to progress in the human sphere. So those are the big ideas of the Enlightenment. So now let's get down and dirty in the details, and for that, let me introduce you to the major French philosophers, and that's just the French word for philosopher, don't get confused. And the reason Enlightenment thought first took root in France is because France was kind of the biggest deal there was on the European continent during this time. All right, the first thinker to know is the Baron de Montesquieu, and as a member of France's noble class, he was not a big fan of the growth of absolutism under Louis XIV. To see the king consolidating all the power under himself was, to Montesquieu, pardon. And that objection animated the production of one of his greatest works, namely The Spirit of the Laws. In this book, Montesquieu argued that separating power into multiple branches of government so that each branch can check the other was the only way to avoid tyranny and encourage equality. The second thing I want to introduce you to is the granddaddy of all French philosophers, namely Voltaire. He was definitely the most famous of the philosophers and probably the most representative of their work. The guy wrote something like 70 books in many different genres and all had one thing in common: criticism of the social and religious institutions of France. Now, Voltaire cringed hard at the religious intolerance that he observed in France, and he spent some time in England and saw that because so many competing versions of religion were allowed, they could exist peacefully. In France, where Catholicism was forcibly imposed upon the population, Voltaire viewed it as oppression. Even so, Voltaire was kind of a big fan of absolutism because he believed that ordinary people weren't really capable of governing themselves, but he argued that absolutism must be tempered by Enlightenment thought. And third, let me introduce you to Denis Diderot. He was responsible for cataloging the new Enlightenment worldview in a work called the Encyclopedia. Now, Diderot didn't write this whole volume, but rather collaborated with many other Enlightenment thinkers to produce over 72,000 articles on every conceivable realm of human life, filtered through the grid of Enlightenment thought. And it's hard to underestimate the influence of this volume on the spread of the Enlightenment. It sold like mad, and as people began reading it, it had a significant impact on how they thought about the world. Now, in addition to publishing books, the ideas of the Enlightenment spread through a variety of institutions. For example, in France, one of the most popular was the salon, which were private meetings held in opulent houses where the intelligentsia openly discussed and debated new ideas of the day. And then for the less well-off, coffee houses provided a place where folks could gather and buy coffee for a penny and discuss the new ideas of the day while drinking enough caffeine to kill a small horse. Okay, now one of the major institutions of focus for Enlightenment thinkers was government and politics. And for that, let me introduce you to two other thinkers who contributed their big brains to this endeavor: John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, there are definitely nuanced differences between these two thinkers, but for our purposes, you just need to know the two main concepts on which Locke and Rousseau agreed. The first political idea these men put forward was the idea of natural rights. And these were rights that people had naturally. Honestly, it's a pretty good name for it. The idea here is that just by virtue of being a human born into the world, everyone had certain rights to which they were entitled. For example, Locke wrote in his second treatise on civil government that people were born with rights to life, liberty, and property, and those rights were granted by the Creator. And that last phrase is crucial to understand. If those rights are given by the Creator, then that means they are not given by a monarch and thus cannot be taken away or infringed upon by a monarch. And in the environment of absolutism that had gripped Europe during that time, that was some spicy sauce. The second political idea these men put forth was the idea of the social contract. Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract, in which he argued that at the bottom of things, the power to govern was in the hands of the people. And in order to protect their natural rights, the people choose to give some of that power over to a government. And then the contract piece of it means that if the government becomes a tyrannical turd, then the people have the right, nay, the responsibility to abolish that government and establish a new one that upholds their rights. The idea here is that people can only be governed by their own consent, and that the root of governance does not reside in the divine right of kings. That sauce is getting even spicy. Now, when I say that Rousseau argued that the power to govern is in the hands of the people, That's not quite accurate. More accurately, all the man people have the power to govern. Rousseau believed that men and women were patently not equal. He taught that women were by nature to remain subservient and to stay home raising children and making their husbands sandwiches. However, in the late 18th century, women like Mary Wollstonecraft objected powerfully to this kind of gendered inequality. Her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, argued that women by nature should have equal rights to men, and moreover, that women should be entitled to the same education as men. Oh baby, let's keep that Enlightenment thinking train going and see how it applied to economics. And for this, I need to introduce you to Adam Smith of the Scottish Enlightenment. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith attacked the mercantilist policies of European nations, and remember, mercantilism was a state-driven economic system. Smith argued instead that governments ought to get their filthy hands out of the economy and instead let people make the economic decisions based on the laws of supply and demand. He argued that decisions made in self-interest and not state interest would ultimately lead to flourishing economies. And so Smith's work became the theoretical basis for concepts of the free market and free trade. Now, at the same time, French economic thinkers known as the physiocrats were arguing for similar economic principles. For example, physiocrat and it's French. Is it Robert? I don't know. I can't imagine a French person saying Robert. We'll say Robert. And Robert Jacques Turgot advocated for laissez-faire economics in France, which, when being translated, means let alone. He argued that the government should have a minimal role in economics and instead let people decide what they wanted to buy and what kind of work they wanted to contribute to society. Now, religious and metaphysical beliefs were also challenged and changed by the Enlightenment. Voltaire popularized a belief called deism. This was the idea that there was indeed a God, but that God was uninvolved in human affairs. The God of deism was like a clockmaker who put all the gears of the universe together and then wound it up real tight and then just let it tick away without any further interference. Now, this, of course, was a serious challenge to Christianity, which emphasized the miraculous intervention of God in human history, not least in the centerpiece of the faith, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Another Scottish thinker named David Hume developed the idea of skepticism. The idea here is that all human knowledge, all our ideas are gained through our sense experience. Like, we taste things, we touch things, we hear things, we see things. And then our brains cobble all that information together into knowledge about the world. And if that's how we get knowledge, then our brains can only really reflect the world as it exists in material reality. And that further means that since God or the creation of the universe cannot be mediated through our senses, then they're not legitimate articles of knowledge. And finally, Diderot, through his encyclopedia, popularized atheism, which is the belief that no God exists. More to the point, an atheist is someone who knows about God and consciously rejects God's existence. Now, with these very public attacks on religion, religious belief more and more became a matter of private instead of public concern. In this way, religious revival movements emphasized personal piety and individual relationships to God. For example, the rise of German pietism in the 17th and 18th centuries. Led by Count Nikolaus von Zinzendorf, pietism taught that true religious experience was not just about belonging to a church, but rather was bound up in the mystical, personal religious experience. Now, in much of Germany, of course, Lutheranism was the accepted religion, but Zinzendorf reacted strongly against the rationalistic approach to Christ that they preached. And then, influenced by German pietism, an English Anglican preacher named John Wesley gave birth to the Methodist movement. After Wesley himself had a powerful personal experience with God, he set out preaching in the streets and in the fields, acts that were considered very improper by the Anglican establishment. But Wesley argued that true Christianity was a matter of the heart, not any external factors. Therefore, to truly know God, a person had to be seized by a great affection. All right, I hope that helped. You should click right here if you want to keep reviewing Unit 4 of AP Euro. You can click right here and get my AP Euro review pack, which is going to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Thanks for coming around. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.